Va, va, va. Sí, se escucha. Déjame cambiar la miniatura un segundo. Aquí está la miniatura buena. Cambiar el título. Vale, creo que ya se cambió y todo, ¿no? ¿Me puede ir buscando mientras dónde se puede ver el directo? Yo mientras voy mirando. Vale. Va cargada la parte alta, pero también la baja. Vale, mientras voy revisando un segundo liquidaciones. Vale. Ahora en poco empezamos. Vale. Vale, mientras voy dejando los análisis. Bien. Esta es la proyección que hemos dejado con el crudo. Por ahora está ejecutando bien. Nada que decir. Pillar parciales simplemente y proteger a ver qué ven las personas que entraron aquí dentro. SP500. Seguir para arriba. Por ahora se está siguiendo lo que estamos diciendo. Zona importante que se ha roto en el U100. Por lo tanto va a seguir subiendo como el SP500. Vale. Vamos a quitar un poco de análisis viejos. Vale, BTC. BTC ya vamos a enfocarnos un poco más. Bien. Vamos a limpiar. Bueno, esto lo dejamos. Vale. Aquí dejé un análisis hoy, que era hasta aquí si no fallo. Que si rompía este rango era para abajo y si rompía este rango para arriba estaba aquí el punto. Aquí va a ser lo mismo. Si rompe este punto yo creo que va a seguir ir a buscar a los 88.500. Por lo tanto hay que esperar. Vamos a ver lo que hará con Powell. En esta zona es para long, ¿vale? Por lo tanto, a eso es lo que esperar. No hay mucho que decir. Puede ir a recoger un poco de liquidez por la parte baja, como estaba diciendo. Por eso prefiero esperar a Powell y ver lo que hará. Vale. Por lo tanto, yo lo dejo con si rompe este punto, ¿vale? Iremos a buscar muy probablemente los 83.300. Si rompe este punto, pues lo mismo. Vamos a buscar la parte alta. Perfecto. Dime, Ted. Dime qué pasó. Déjame un segundo mirar dónde podemos ver el live de Powell. Mira si lo puedes buscar donde ver el directo. No lo encuentro. A ver si lo puedes encontrar tú, Ted. Bueno, a lo mejor si hago así, seguramente así me... Déjame un segundo buscar, a ver si ya salió algo. Un segundito. Perfecto. Mientras vamos dejando aquí, que ya la encontré. Vale, ya la encontré. Es que creo que tengo que ponerlo sí o sí así, porque si no, no. Es que si lo pongo en pantalla completa, no me va a salir. Por lo tanto, lo único que me queda es hacer esto. Ah, bueno. No, después switchamos cuando. No, lo tengo que juntar aquí. Y ya está. Después switchamos fácil. Ya está. Ah, perfecto. Vale. Así está el análisis que tenemos. MSTR ya cumplió. Aquí tenía una entrada. Esto fuera. Dominancia BTC sigue subiendo. Puede subir un poco más. Vale. Segundo. No sé por qué me apareció el otro modelo. Vale. Ahora está limpio. Perfecto. Eh, puede seguir subiendo. Aquí tenemos la dominancia de Ethereum que puede seguir bajando porque aquí tenemos un BART. O bueno, tenemos casi una confirmación de M. Vale. Aquí quiero pararme un segundito. Esto va a ser muy importante, ¿vale? Aquí puede que estemos delante de un fallo de quinta, ¿vale? Puede que esta 5 no se extienda y termine aquí, que sería muy bueno para nosotros. Pero con Powell podría meter mechazo. BTC no está en un momento para meter mechazo, yo creo. Por lo tanto, puede que se produzca un fallo de quinta, ¿vale? Es muy probable. Por lo tanto, a lo mejor esta zona va a aguantar. Bien, el Others, como dije, rompió esta zona, se iba a la mierda, todas las altcoins cayeron, por lo tanto no hay mucho que decir. Ahí simplemente hay que esperar que esto se un segundo ralentice, empiece a coger fuerza y se dé la vuelta. Seguramente tocando el punto 61 ya empieza a coger un pelín de más de fuerza y se pare. Ethereum, nada que decir, lo más probable es que volvemos a entrar en esa zona. Si Powell dice algo malo, pues aquí esta zona otra vez, a buscar zona más baja, a limpiar el 88 y aquí se puede buscar una entrada en el 88. Vale, y ya está, no hay mucho que decir, por lo tanto hay que esperar estas zonas. Vamos a esperar con BTC. Vale, vamos a esperar, vamos a esperar. Bien, ¿tienen alguna duda mientras? Es que no hay mucho que decir hasta que empiece Powell. Ya tenemos el análisis, aquí para abajo, aquí para arriba. Buenas. Ya va un poco empezando esto. Y ahora están seteando a ver. El viejito. Mira qué cara linda. ¿Ustedes pueden ver la otra pantalla o no? Segundito. Déjenme ver si se ve la otra pantalla. No, se ve solo la pantalla del... Déjenme un segundo. Vale, ya se ve, ¿no? Sí, ya está. La plata. Plata. Vale, la plata. Pues nada, la plata yo creo que va a corregir un poquito ahí. Pero para seguir subiendo hasta esta zona. Así lo había dejado. Para arriba. Puede que aquí haga una corrección pequeñita para ir a buscar esta zona. Pero por lo general es todo para arriba. Menos BTC. Bueno, depende de cómo lo que diga ahora Powell, pero vamos a ver lo que tira. Faltan 7 minutos igual. Pero la plata está fuerte. Lo que sí va a ser fuerte también es el cobre, yo creo, ¿eh? El cobre va a hacer este empuje. Va a ir a 15 minutos. Vale. No sé que me había comentado el sumo, pero bueno. Aquí hubo retroceso para volverse a montar. Aquí es para arriba. Espero que sea el primero, así ya empieza a moverse el mercado. Y no vamos a dormir. Bueno, mientras voy mirando un poco cómo va todo, pero por ahora está todo parado. Déjeme revisar. Es que en un diario sí hay liquidez por la parte baja, en todo. Por lo que Powell puede activar esa liquidez. Pero bueno, vamos a ver. Vamos a mirar liquidaciones. Bueno, lo hago por este lado. Así no molesta. Vale. Liquidaciones. Aquí tenemos un montón de liquidaciones, ¿vale? Este está cargadito de liquidaciones. Y aquí también. 84. Aquí tenemos liquidaciones también. Vamos a cambiar colores. Ah, mentira. Dejo violeta y cambio la letra. Vale, vámonos preparando. ver si empiezan estos viejitos ya para ir a dormir, joder. Por ahora ningún movimiento, ¿eh? Sigue estando lateral hasta Powell seguro. Compresión, sí. A ver si es correcto, pero creo que sí. Un segundito, déjenme revisar si es el correcto. Pero yo creo que sí es el correcto. Vale, sí es el correcto. Epa.
Those three undergraduates
Se escucha.
want their picture taken with you.
I can do that.
They've been at me for about a week. Got it. Okay. Scott, ready to go?
Bueno, yo no lo escucho, mejor dicho.
Well, we could just enjoy the silence for a moment. I am Peter Robinson, the Murdoch Fellow here at the Hoover Institution. Welcome to the second of three panel discussions in honor of the late Secretary of State and longtime fellow here at the Hoover Institution, George Shultz. The first panel concerned Mr. Shultz as a champion of human rights. The third and final panel will discuss his contributions to foreign policy. This panel is George Shultz as an economist. With us, Mike Boskin, who has been a Hoover Fellow for about a quarter of a century, whose public service includes chairing the Council of the President Council of Economic Advisors in the administration of President George H.W. Bush, and whose private work involves many board memberships, including longtime board membership at Oracle. Condoleezza Rice. I'll go ahead with the introduction just to be. I think everybody knows who Condi Rice is. Public service includes National Security Advisor and Secretary of State in the administration of President George W. Bush. Private service includes Provost of Stanford University and Director, which brings us to the man who wins the award for the most distance traveled to join us here this evening. Jerome Powell earned his undergraduate degree from Princeton and his law degree from Georgetown. I should mention that at Princeton he was a member of the same eating club as George Shultz and first became aware of the presence and career of George Shultz by having lunch under George Shultz's picture, correct?
Something like that.
Something like that. All right. Jerome Powell's government service includes service at the Treasury Department during the presidency of George H.W. Bush, his work in the private sector as a partner at the Carlyle Group. Since 2018, Jay Powell has served as chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Chairman Powell will begin this evening with some brief opening remarks. Jay?
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Condi. Thank you, Michael, and thanks to everyone for being here. I'm deeply honored to have been asked to speak here today about the remarkable legacy of George Shultz. And just to be clear right at the start, I will not address current economic conditions or monetary policy. So I've been an admirer of George Shultz since my college years. I saw him then and now as a great role model. As I mentioned just a few months ago when delivering the baccalaureate address to Princeton's class of 2025, 50 years after my own graduation. As I told the graduates, when I faced the world after college, I had no real plan, but I knew that I wanted to combine a private sector career with public service. And I had in mind a few well-known public figures of the era, especially George Shultz, who by then had left to go to Bechtel, whose picture, as I recall, was on the wall of the Princeton Eating Club, of which both of us were members, the Quadrangle Club. George may also have caught my attention because my dad was a labor lawyer who represented one of the major steel companies in collective bargaining. Like George, my father had both a belief in the collective bargaining process and a deep respect for workers. So I followed George's career with interest through the years. It didn't occur to me that I would ever have the honor of meeting him. But I did meet him after I joined the Fed in 2012 as I visited Stanford from time to time. And I remember energetic economic discussions at group lunches in the conference room at Hoover. George was also kind enough to host John Taylor, Michael, and me for a chilly round of golf on a rainy March day. So today our focus is on George Shultz's extraordinarily broad economic accomplishments. But I also want to celebrate the remarkable man and policymaker that he was, and several things stand out for me. He was a man who combined strong principles and unshakable integrity with common sense and practical problem-solving approach to policy. He had a deep belief in the wisdom of markets and a desire to let them work whenever possible without government direction. And that theme runs through many of the issues that we'll discuss today, including collective bargaining, wage and price controls, and exchange rates. But he was not an absolutist, and he saw that there are sometimes market failures that do require being addressed by public policy. As one of the most successful policymakers of his era, George brought the intellectual rigor of an academic to the practical, constrained, messy work of policymaking. Through 4 cabinet appointments, he dealt with many of the great issues of his day with remarkable success. And he kept at it long after leaving public office, making important contributions here at Hoover on healthcare reform, climate change, nuclear disarmament, and other areas. He may be less well known for this, but George Shultz was deeply concerned about racial discrimination in the workplace and in our society more broadly. He consistently and effectively used his positions of authority to increase opportunities for minorities. And he later noted that there was both a moral and an economic case for this. He stuck to his principles while also treating people with honesty and respect, including those with whom he had policy disagreements. Labor leaders welcomed his appointment as Secretary of Labor, and as many of his contemporaries remarked, faced with divergent views and difficult issues, he was extraordinarily good at steering people toward agreement. A key part of that strategy was to let the parties reach the final agreement themselves. That way, they owned the agreement and were more likely to honor it. His friendships and collaborations were beyond number and knew no partisan bounds. He often said that trust is the coin of the realm and that good things were only possible where there was mutual trust. His integrity provided the basis for that trust. All of those who aspire to serve the public can learn from his example.
Thank you. George Shultz's professional training, labor economics. Mr. Shultz earned his doctorate from MIT in 1949, taught at MIT for 9 years, then moved to the University of Chicago where he served for 11 years, 6 years as Dean of the Business School. Jay, labor economics, the importance of labor in the last century. Help us reconstruct that intellectual world.
So it was such a different world. Private sector unionization today in the United States is under 6%. In those days, it was around 30%. And collective bargaining for the major manufacturing unions in steel and autos and things like that, that was front page news everywhere. The job of the Secretary of Labor in any administration was to know the labor movement, know the leaders, and understand what they wanted. It was a very, very different time. And of course, George Shultz had studied collective bargaining. That was one of his main topics in his work as a labor economist, and he was extraordinarily well qualified to face the challenges of a labor secretary, and indeed went to Los Angeles to talk to President-elect Nixon, just to make sure that President-elect Nixon knew what George's views were on labor economics.
And he's a labor economist. This is the middle of the last century, when there's a great debate about labor taking place in the world. The communists had a certain view about labor. Workers of the world unite. This is Mr. Schultz. I'm quoting an interview he gave when he was here at Hoover, looking back over his career.
Si habla
The Chicago School
del
stood for the fundamental value of
UEQT,
freedom
¿vale?
and free markets, close quote. Mike,
Puede que se
Condi,
empiece a mover un poco el
how
mercado.
did he integrate this belief in free markets
Porque si
into
empieza con el
labor
QE, hablando de
economics?
eso, es porque van a
let
inyectar
me
liquidez al
start by
sistema.
saying that when I
Y
was
eso va a
asked to be
hacer subir
Secretary of
todo.
State by President Bush, actually the only person I called to ask about the job was George Shultz. And I said, so George, what do you think? He said, well, it's the best job in government. And I said,
Por
well,
ahora
George, you
líquido
should
aquí.
know because you've held almost every other job in government. But the reason that he said that is perhaps part of the answer to your question, Peter. He said that
Vale,
he
después dime lo que
always
piensas.
fundamentally believed that the United States had the right foundational principles, and that was much of the reason for our success.
Qué feo.
One of those foundational principles was, of course, the free market.
Tiene que ser
And of
muy
course,
feo,
the
¿no?
Chicago
Esa es
schools,
la-
particularly in
lo que te
Latin
hace falta
America
para
and
trabajar
other
ahí.
places, had, he thought, the chance to bring other countries out of poverty, to use their resources best, and to gain prosperity. But he also believed in the inextricable link between free markets and individual liberty. And that reflected in the way that
Hacer
he
análisis,
took
¿eh?
on the challenge, of course, being the Secretary of State as the Soviet Union was beginning to go into its twilight. We forget that George's first years as Secretary, the Soviet Union was a bit on the march. It was 1982, 83, 84. The sense that the Soviet Union was really the future. And from George's point of view, this was nonsense. And this is something that he shared, of course, with Ronald Reagan.
Literal, si ponen eso ya volamos.
That this experiment, as Reagan had called it, this experiment that was practiced on a hapless people would end up on the ash heap of history. Now, George, who was a
Bueno,
great
mientras
diplomat,
hablas
would
de
never have
inútil,
said it so boldly
Tiene que
as
ser
Reagan
con
did.
cuerpo, ¿vale?
But
15
because they believed in the
cuerpo.
fundamental
Aquí
principles of the free
o aquí.
market and
Mecha no
individual
sirve,
liberty,
con
the
cuerpo.
Soviet Union was on the wrong side of history. And they were together perfectly willing to say that, perfectly willing to challenge the system. There's a story that Mike likes to tell of George meeting with Gorbachev and saying to Gorbachev, you know, that central planning thing that you've got going, maybe you'd better take off with planning because you all aren't doing it very well. And can you imagine Gorbachev at that point thinking, who is this guy and why is he telling me about my own economy? But because he had been a great economist, because he'd been Secretary of the Treasury, I think George was able to bring this knowledge of how the free market worked, along with his belief in the free
Literal.
market and his belief in individual
Yo creo que
liberty
con Kamala ya
to
estábamos en
really
500 ya con
challenge
Kamala.
many of the assumptions about the strength of the Soviet Union at that particular point in time, and then to be there, of course, for the
estamos hablando de
beginning of the
chorradas.
end.
Mike, a question for you on the longshoreman strike. Let me set it up. The Nixon years, just after George becomes Secretary of Labor under President Nixon in January '69, he finds himself confronted with the longshoreman strike. He's under intense pressure for the government to
Pregunta a los
intervene,
inútiles.
but he insists on keeping the federal
Joder.
government out of it, forcing the longshoremen and management to the bargaining table on their own.
Con Kamala,
Instead of damaging the entire economy, the
No, no te
strike
creas.
settles just a month after George Shultz takes
Yo
office.
creo que con Kamala,
Why was that such an
con las
important
políticas monetarias
episode?
expansivas que hubiera
First of
tenido,
all, it set a really important example.
hubiera
Government
ha
intervention
sido que se los
sometimes
mercados,
can be an obstacle rather than
porque todo se hubiera refugiado en
provider of
Bitcoin y
successful
las criptos,
outcomes.
con Kamala.
Number two, it's really important because it signaled that people could make their own decisions and would be forced to if they were confronting each other rather than wait around for the government to come in. They wouldn't make their best offers, they wouldn't get serious. This became very clear to me. I was a beneficiary of George's advice and friendship, and we did a lot of things together over the years. Maybe talk about that a bit later, but it becomes really apparent when you're dealing with a whole different context than people that aren't used to thinking about markets, people that aren't used to thinking about individual incentives, people being able to think that way. And that goes back to Jay's comments and Candy's about as being an economist. He was used to this idea that people were trying to do the best they can themselves given their environment, and that if you let them do that, that would collectively lead to the best possible outcome. Kind of a basic theorem of basic economics, which some people forget, and there's always a pressure for the government to do something. If you know, all of us have been, Jay still is, but we've been in public office, and the first thing every morning in the briefing room is what's the president going to do about X? And it could be anything. It could be anything the president shouldn't have any worry about, shouldn't even know about. But so it's important to set that example and to let things play out until there really is something that you desperately need the government to intervene for, if that happens.
Two incidents in the Nixon years that are less, strictly speaking, economic than social. The Philadelphia Plan. In the spring of 1969, George Shultz issues the Philadelphia Plan, which requires federal contractors to hire minority workers, and he famously makes the remark that he's not imposing quotas, he's ending a quota, and the quota that he was ending was on black workers, and it was 0. As Secretary of Labor, he also ran the White House Cabinet Committee on Education, which was charged with developing a strategy for the peaceful integration of schools in the 7 states of the Deep South. He ended up running it because Vice President Spiro Agnew wanted nothing to do with it. He was given the chairmanship and never turned up for any meetings. There's a famous moment, I've heard Mr. Shultz himself tell this story. George Shultz has the chairs of the Mississippi Committee come in. It's a white man and a black man, and he has them sit down together in the White House. And as they get close to an agreement, Secretary of State leaves the room. And I'm quoting George Shultz here. I learned long ago, you mentioned this in your remarks, Jay. I learned long ago that when parties get this close to an agreement, it's best to let them complete their deal on their own. That way the agreement belongs to them, close quote. By the end of the Nixon administration, this is a statistic I found staggering, I wasn't aware of it, more than 90% of black children in the South were attending integrated schools. All right, he's a labor economist, but in the Philadelphia Plan and in the integration of schools in the South, he's solving social problems. What's going on here? This has something to do with his own principles, with the respect in which everyone holds him. Jay, would you like to address these episodes?
I would. So this is something that people need to know more about George Shultz. This is an extraordinary accomplishment, and it is consistent through his career. He started the first minority program to bring kids into the University of Chicago Business School and many other things along the way. But in this case, Brown v. Board was decided in 1954. This is 15 years later, and there are 7 southern states that have just not desegregated their schools. The Supreme Court makes it clear that the argument is over and we're going to do this. George Shultz he takes over this commission, and he picks a black person and a white person from each of the 7 states. He gets them together, and they figure out how to do this because they now know this is going to happen, and he gets them to realize that, and the whole idea is this has got to be done without violence, and he manages to get that done. It's an extraordinary accomplishment. How did he do it? This is the sort of the full Shultz playbook of bringing people together, treating them with respect, empowering them, enabling them to take on this terrible, difficult issue. And it really worked. I mean, the schools did open without violence in these 7 southern states, and it's quite a remarkable story, and he really made it happen. So quite extraordinary.
Well, actually, I lived it.
Yeah.
Because I was a kid in elementary school in Birmingham, Alabama, in the early 1960s. And Brown versus Board of Education 54, essentially nothing happens in integration of the schools, despite the striking down of separate but equal.
They just ignored it.
They just ignored it, just ignored it. And then finally, after the Supreme Court, so they came up with this plan called, just before before George's intervention, called choice. Now, choice is a good thing these days. In those days, it wasn't a particularly good choice because
Porque
the
están haciendo más
idea
preguntas más
was
personales,
probably white parents would
y no
choose
están
to keep
hablando
their kids in
sobre
white schools,
lo que quieren hacer
and
sobre la
black
economía.
parents would choose to send their kids to white schools. As it turns out, nobody chose to do anything. And this is actually kind of a funny story, a few poor teachers were sent to integrate the faculties of these schools. And my mother was one who was going to be sent to a white school.
Really?
Yes, my father was terrified because he was worried about the potential violence. As it turns out, my mother didn't go, but they sent this poor white woman to our school at Druid High School. And I felt so bad for her because everybody just treated her really, really badly. You know, she was the only one. So this was going pretty imperfectly. And I think one reason that I told this story to George, and I think one reason it was important to get people together and then get a plan for how to do this, which is what the Philadelphia plan really was because it was going nowhere, and to the degree that it was going anywhere, it wasn't going in a very good direction. And so George and I would kind of laugh about my own personal experience in what was going on in the South before the Philadelphia plan.
It's worth mentioning that affirmative action has gotten a bad name of late, and California voters have rejected it twice, and perhaps it went overboard a bit. But back then, in the Philadelphia building trades, there was a quota of 0 African Americans. And so economists hate quotas. And a quota of 0 is a bad quota, just like a quota of a large amount. Okay, so I think it reflects back on thinking as an economist. And as Jay said, there was obviously a moral as well as an economic justification.
Well, I think he felt the moral side very strongly because both in the Philadelphia plan and in the work with the school system, because again, it went back to George's view that America was the hope of the world. America was the place that had gotten mostly right, but there were times when America had not gotten it right, and on this, we had not.
Back to economics in the Nixon administration, and here I'm going to ask
Hasta el market
the
maker
three
se
of
está
you
aburriendo, no
just
está haciendo nada.
to give me a seminar. We've got the closing of the gold window, and we've got wage and price controls. So I'll set up with what I know, which is very little. In 1970, Mr. Schultz becomes director of OMB. He's one of a circle of advisors, including Secretary of Treasury John Connally and Undersecretary of the Treasury Paul Volcker, who advised President Nixon to end the convertibility of the dollar into gold. President Nixon closes the gold window on August 15th, 1971. I'm going to quote Milton Friedman, his observation on this, quote, "The closing of the gold window opened the way to a free market for the dollar where there was none before."
Mientras este habla un poco de historia,
again, we're dealing with something here so foreign to the way we do
resumen
business
es
and
que
think
está
about
hablando
the
de
currencies
niños,
today that
de
requires a
racismo y
little
más
bit of effort
cositas,
simply to
pero nada
take
importante.
us back to the moment when the dollar was pegged to gold and what the debate concerned, why it was important. Who would like to take on? Mike,
I guess I'll start. So if we go back to the end of World War II and what George and Condi like to call the Global Economic and Security Commons was established, the International Monetary Fund, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and the World Bank were established. And we established the dollar
Ahora
as the
está aguantando el
centerpiece
61,
of the
puede que siga
exchange rate
subiendo.
system.
Si este punto no
Most
se rompe en
countries would
5
have fixed
minutos, va a subir.
exchange rates, and the U.S. would peg the dollar, exchange dollars for $35 per ounce of gold, and it pledged to do that for the foreign reserves, dollar reserves of foreign countries.
Mira, hasta
So
Powell
this
está
again
aburrido,
was
mira esta
George
cara.
in the international arena
Hasta
as
él está
well,
aburrido,
because
mira,
it affected other countries.
¿sabes? ¿Por qué está aquí?
Now,
Está diciendo, ¿por
That
qué?
enabled us to backstop economic growth across much of the world. Is that the idea?
It's a little more complicated than that. And I don't want to bore people in the audience with this. But what it meant was you could not have other countries and could not have an independent monetary policy along with the fixed exchange rates and free capital flows. Because if their interest rates were lower than ours, capital would flow out. They'd be pressured to devalue their currencies, and the opposite if their interest rates were higher than ours.
Mira,
So it created
está
quite
modo
a
señorita
conundrum.
Powell, mira.
And We've seen that in more recent
Está
years when
diciendo, mira,
countries that
dame
pegged
alguna
their currency to the
noticia,
dollar
dame alguna
ended
pregunta
that, and
buena
we've
que
seen
quiera
that
hacer joder el
happen, so
mercado
it's
aquí,
chaotic.
que aquí están muy tranquilos.
So this, I think, was a major move. There had been a big intellectual debate for decades in economics about whether fixed or flexible exchange rates were better, and I think the flexible market-oriented approach wound up winning, I think, to the world's advantage. So that was part one. Part two was because of this sudden change, and the dollar, we weren't going to exchange $35 for an ounce of gold anymore. Foreigners were holders of U.S. dollar reserves were going to be in a pickle, and so they had to we couldn't revalue the dollar. They had to revalue against us, and so what happened was President Nixon imposed a 10% import charge that was going to be removed if and when they revalued their currencies appropriately, which is what happened. And within 18 months, the world kind of came to a bit of a equilibrium and things were going okay. And then a year later, we had the oil shock Jay referred to earlier.
And so
no va a decir nada,
I can't resist asking the chairman of the Fed if it worked. If we hadn't had the oil shock, it was a good idea.
We were going to switch to a floating rate system eventually. Milton Friedman was right about this, and it was a good thing that we did.
Okay, so this brings us, Condi, would you hop in on the gold window?
Which person here is not like the others? I'll leave that to the economist.
All right, then the wage and price controls, again, I'll set it up. President Nixon imposes wage and price controls. Director, as he was then, director of the Office of Management and Budget, George Shultz opposes the measure, but finds himself overruled by John Connally, as Secretary of the Treasury, and Richard Nixon. In 1972, George Shultz himself becomes Secretary of the Treasury, and by January 1973, he had abolished most of the mandatory controls. He abolished the controls entirely in April 1974, just before stepping down as Secretary of the Treasury in May. So again, it is inconceivable. The notion that a president of the United States would impose wage and price controls strikes me as inconceivable now. So we need this sort of reconstruction of what were they thinking. And then also, is it fair to see this this episode as a kind of the old statist view represented by John Connally versus the new Chicago school thinking in terms of free markets represented by George Shultz? Is it as simple and straightforward as that? Mike, do you want to take a shot at
No tiene sentido mucho escucharlos ahora mismo.
For many, many decades, economists have debated, and we thought we had won this battle, but it's come back several times since. The propriety of using what's called incomes policies, which were basically the government jawboning business and labor, which may have made sense in an economy where a large fraction of the labor force was unionized. Unions were very powerful. If it made sense at all, that's when it made sense. But in any event, we wound up in this situation where we had just a remarkable series of key intellectuals coming to the conclusion that we weren't really sure what we could do about inflation and unemployment occurring at the same time. We had to do something. We didn't want to inflict any pain about disinflating the economy and causing a recession. We couldn't use monetary and fiscal policy very well. This became a big debate, and we thought it had ended successfully with the end of wage and price controls, but it came back. In fact, when I was advising candidate Reagan in 1980, the campaign asked me to debate Walter Heller, who'd been President Kennedy's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors and a key architect of the Kennedy tax cuts, on this precise point. And you had, like the head of the AFL-CIO, key industrial business leaders, like the heads of DuPont, Lane Kirkland and Ernest Shapiro, deciding they would decide what to do with the government in the room, kind of getting back to the point Jay made earlier. And fortunately, that didn't happen. We had a successful, if painful, disinflation. But I'll turn it back to Jay, because I know he has some views on this as well.
Yes, Jay.
So, I mean, the interesting thing to me is that, as Michael pointed out, there was almost a consensus that we needed income policy. In other words, that the government needed to jawbone companies informally, at least, let alone, and then maybe would eventually need to do wage and price control. So if you go back to 1966, George Shultz held a famous conference with another University of Chicago person, and it was on guidelines. And the big names of the era debated. Milton Friedman famously debated Bob Solow over this, but people really thought that there was a problem to solve. There was a general agreement that the problem of high inflation and high unemployment, that fiscal policy wasn't going to be able to handle that, monetary policy wasn't, so you needed the government to somehow do this. This was a bad idea. It was a really bad idea, and somehow it had become approximately conventional wisdom in these days. Milton Friedman, of course, was a big exception. George Shultz was on the right side of that. Paul Volcker was on the right side of that. But to me, there's a takeaway there, which is that, our understanding of the economy is ever evolving. The economy itself is ever evolving. So I think those of us who are doing economic policy have always got to remember that the structure of the economy is always changing, and that our understanding of it is always highly uncertain. So certain things that are sometimes accepted as conventional wisdom, people will look back in 50 years and think, like we're doing with wage price controls. They're going to say, what were they thinking at the time? Well, that's what they were thinking. They were thinking it was really the beginnings of stagflation, high unemployment and high inflation. What do we do? Very difficult problem.
No llegaste
and
atrasado
Paul Volcker
porque
kind
igual
of had
esto
the
no está
answer
diciendo
and
nada.
eventually did it. George Shultz deserves credit for supporting him, and Reagan deserves credit for supporting him as well.
Yes, Condi, of course.
Yeah, I was just going to say that this is also quintessentially George Shultz. So he lost the argument. But he understood who was elected, and he was able to bide his time, and then when he had the opportunity, he worked to move things in the other direction. But George was, in that way, quintessentially a pragmatist always, also.
He played a long game.
He played a long game, and I think it isn't as well understood that when you're in government sometimes, you're going to win some and you're going to lose some, but if you never lose sight of what you think is right, you might have a chance to correct it. And I know that the wage and price controls, for George, this was really an anathema, and he thought one of the arguments that he was most unhappy that he lost, because he thought it did great damage. But when he had the opportunity, he reversed it.
So, yes, one quick comment with respect to Condi's comment about winning some losing. We always thought we were doing well if we were above Shaq's free throw percentage. But it's important to remember what was going on in the economy, as Jay has mentioned. Nixon imposed wage and price controls when inflation got up to 4%. It's important to have that historical reference in the back of your mind.
So, thank you for the seminar. What I hadn't realized is the extent to which there was a debate going on within the discipline of economics when the shock hits.
No está diciendo
Which
nada,
means you don't have,
no sé qué comentarte porque está hablando de niños
the word establishment, but you
o
don't
de
have
negros.
consensus on how to respond when the oil shock hits. And the 70s, the economy is taking one blow after another, and the economists there's a debate about what should be done. There's a kind of uncertainty. Is that fair?
La invirtió, ahora invirtió las piernas. Está más convencido de la cosa.
Ronald Reagan.
Ahora está listo para la pregunta buena.
Hadn't thought of it this way before.
Al final de la entrevista le hace la pregunta: ¿a dónde nos vamos?
George Shultz, before becoming Secretary of State, which he did about a year into the administration, he chaired President Reagan's Economic Policy Advisory Group, a group that included figures such as Milton Friedman. This is Mr. Shultz in a 2000 interview talking about those times. The advisory group said the essence of the inflation problem is monetary policy.
Póngalo en bonito la de que este video. Que mientras que están hablando paja, encima que esté despierta esta hora para sentir y escuchar. Bueno, para escuchar estos tíos hablando de nada.
By the way, I was there for that bit, and people did warn him just that. Back to George Shultz.
Lo que puedo sacar de esta entrevista es que no son racistas y votaban demócratas.
But inflation dropped like a stone. And that has been one of the primary reasons why our economy has been as strong as it has been, close quote. So from Richard Nixon's wage and price controls to the moment when
Los corazones no son likes,
Ronald
Los
Reagan
corazones de
backs
chat
Paul
no son likes.
Volcker,
Quiero un like en
dollar
el video.
represents an intellectual, it's not just a it's an intellectual victory. Is that right? Am I understanding that correctly, Mike?
In that 10-year period, we also had President Carter in 1979 go on national television, complain about high inflation and malaise, and said the Fed should lower interest rates to reduce inflation. So there's a lot of misunderstanding in the polity as well. But it's a remarkable transformation. In 1979, this goes back to Condi's discussion of George liked to garden, but he also did that in economic policy. Not only bided his time and changed things when he had the opportunity, but he prepared. And so in 1979, we had a dinner with candidate Reagan, and he invited myself and Milton Friedman and a couple of other economists to kick the tires about supply-side economics and about inflation. And I was very much impressed because Reagan's knowledge and subtlety of understanding these things and depth of understanding was quite a bit different from the caricature of his portrayal at the time. And so I think that George was preparing for this moment and letting Reagan talk to some people that he came to respect and work with him and for him, and developed an understanding. And Reagan also had very strong principles, and he understood how serious high inflation was. Keynes, in a remarkable book, 1919, saying what will happen from the Treaty of Versailles, hyperinflation, et cetera, from Germany, that will destroy the society, quoted Lenin's injunction that debauching the currency is the surest way to destroy capitalism. And so it's a very, very strong sense in Reagan that we have, at the time, inflation's double digits, and had been rising at the same point of every business cycle since the 1960s. If you measure the trough, the midpoint, or the peak, it's going up and up and up, and it peaked at around 13%. And so there was a desperate need to disinflate the economy. It was painful, but it was the right thing to do.
Condi, you remember those? Well, you were still at Denver, weren't you?
No, I just become a faculty member at Stanford and was trying to buy a house. And I do remember.
So you do remember inflation?
I remember it very, very well.
But
I was going to make a point about George in this regard, because we all know that George Shultz was a very fine public servant, and it was mentioned he cared about these intellectual debates. He cared about winning the debate with ideas. It wasn't name-calling. It wasn't, you're just evil. He actually liked to get ideas on the table and debate them. And he liked to debate them with people who disagreed. And when he had an opportunity with Reagan, he brought people together for Reagan to listen and to hear the ideas. And Mike mentioned this, you were there. I would see it later with George W. Bush. And that George would bring together these groups of people for these politicians, and he would count on the ability to convince and persuade through good ideas to really challenge people who wanted to be the elected officials who were going to carry out policy, to really understand what they were listening to. And I have to say the Hoover Institution played quite an important role in this, people like Milton Friedman and others, Mike Boskin. But it was George who would convene these people with people who were going to actually be in government, who were actually going to run for office. We sometimes, as people in the academy or people who, like Mike and I or Jay, have served in government, people say, well, I like policy but not politics. Well, unfortunately, policy has to go through politics to actually become policy. And George understood that, and so he often spent a lot of time with the people who were actually making decisions, trying to convince them. With Ronald Reagan, he found somebody who had everything that needed to change many of our assumptions about the way we were.
It wasn't just in Washington. The second time George dragooned me into doing something. The first time when his Treasury Secretary called me, I'd never met him, and he got me involved. Marty Feldstein as the advisor to the commission to talk about the benefits of philanthropy and the benefits of the tax deduction for raising lots of money for charities, probably more than the government was losing in revenue by allowing the deduction. Then a few years later, it was to go up to Sacramento to talk to then Governor Brown in his first of his two stints as
Pero es que no está hablando de nada importante, literalmente, ¿no?
And the California is running a large surplus.
Lo voy a dejar hasta que
very
termine,
high
me faltan 20
inflation.
minutos, pero...
The tax brackets weren't indexed, some revenue was rolling into the state. And
de hecho, el precio está quedando en rango porque no está hablando nada. Están hablando más de opiniones personales sobre racismo, niños,
the governor wanted to convince us to back him running a bigger and bigger surplus, and which I think he wanted to do to later on have an even larger tax cut and run for president. But in any event, So we went up there, and a cute anecdote is at the time he was dating Linda Ronstadt. And so
Governor Brown.
Governor Brown, not George. Absolutely. Absolutely. Obi wouldn't have gone for that. And in any event, and so lunch was kind of dietetic. He was in training. In any event, we thought this was a bad idea, and that's one of the untold stories of how Prop 13, the California's property tax revolt and initiative that limited property tax increases, happened because this was going on while the state had a gigantic surplus.
Jay, can you work Linda Ronstadt into?
I don't think I can.
Oh, all right. So when you look back on this episode with Nixon, which I now see actually, it's important to understand it as part of a continuum from Nixon wage and price controls to what takes place in '81, backing Volcker to shrink the money supply. I'm struck that again and again, George Shultz is there. Furthermore, that we think of him so often, people emphasize character, which is totally fair and true, of course, but he took the life of the mind, this is the point Condi made, he took his intellectual life extremely seriously. And we've got this intellectual project taking place at the University of Chicago. They believe they reach conclusions, Milton Friedman and George Stigler and George Shultz. And then it's George Shultz who has this kind of genius to take the intellectual findings.
Sí, es que no sé ni risa los chistes que están tirando.
Strange territory between intellectuals
Además,
and
Powell está como viejita,
office
míralo.
holders
Está
to get the
como
right thing
viejita.
done. So what does that now? I know you
Sentado
knew
como
George
abuela
Shultz
está.
the least, but I actually find that a striking datum that you took the time to fly out here because he means so much to you as an example. So what does that tell us about
Mira cómo está sentado.
the way
Como una tía.
an intellectual, an academic goes about public service at its best?
So he obviously got the big things he got right. So collective bargaining he got right, exchange rates he got right, wage and price controls. He was right on those issues, and history has very much vindicated that. And of course, he was a great Secretary of State and helped end the Cold War. I mean, we could be here just listing his, let alone discussing his many accomplishments. But I would say as important as his extraordinary achievements is the way he approached public policy. I am very, it resonates very much with me that the way he brought people together with respect and integrity and wound up being able to foster agreements on super difficult issues like this desegregation of the schools in the Deep South and many other areas. He was an extraordinary
Yo creo que está
public
sentado así
servant,
porque
even
tiene
if
que ir
you
al baño.
didn't agree
Y
with
está aguantando, ¿ves?
those
¿Ves que está
policy
aguantando aquí
conclusions which I
para que no vaya al
did.
baño?
So that's another aspect.
Yeah, he continued to do that until very late in life. He was convening things at Hoover. Hoover, he was a huge presence here. He often convened groups on various issues. I was privileged to do many, sometimes with colleagues here, especially John Cogan and John Taylor, on economic stuff. But he always tried to get alternative points of view. He tried to get people debating and discussing, and he tried to get people in a conference room we had called the Annenberg here, and we would sit there and we'd understand facts and theories and data and history and debate about what the best path forward was on a variety of pretty complicated issues that often don't have just singularly clear conclusions, but have trade-offs, involve something else that being an economist teaches you to pay a lot of attention to.
Bueno,
George Shultz as teacher. George Shultz
faltan 15
becomes
minutos.
Secretary of State in
Y en 15 minutos tuve que
1982,
sacar algo
and he serves
importante.
until the end of the Reagan administration. Most of his work as Secretary of State will belong to the third of these conversations about him. But there's an episode or an aspect of his time as Secretary of State that shows George Shultz right back where he started, teaching economics. I'm quoting now from The Cold War by John Lewis Gaddis. Gaddis notes that as early as 1985, Secretary of State George Shultz began telling General Secretary Gorbachev that the Soviet Union would continue falling behind as long as it had a command economy. Now I'm quoting Gaddis. "You should take over the planning office here in Moscow," Gorbachev joked, because you
Mira
have
aquí.
more ideas than they have. In a way, that is what
Esta
Schultz
gente
did.
ni que está
Over the
escuchando el
next
live, está
several
viendo solo
years,
cosas a
he
voleo.
used his trips to Moscow
Porque si
to
de verdad
run
estuvieran escuchando
tutorials
lo que está diciendo
for
este tío,
Gorbachev and his advisors,
estarían ahí
even bringing
durmiendo ya.
pie charts to the Kremlin. Gorbachev proved surprisingly receptive, close quote. Condi,
Yeah.
this is, I mean, it
Yes,
sounds almost like a Monty Python sketch, but it
Right.
happened.
And look, I think this is one where George had mixed results. And I would say they were mixed results because it was very hard to penetrate the Gorbachev or any of them, the idea that this thing called capitalism and markets could actually make everybody richer. And I remember Gorbachev saying at one point, actually George H.W. Bush, he was trying to explain how in capitalism somebody will found a company. And yes, they'll get rich from that, but there'll be all these jobs and the economy will grow and so forth and so on.
Aquí mentes
And at one
muy
point,
fuertes aquí.
George
Mira
H.W.
cómo
Bush
está sentado
turned to me
Powell.
and said, "Are they translating this?" And I said,
Está así
"Mr.
con los
President, I'm
pies.
afraid this just doesn't translate." All right. So, but George was indefatigable. He would go and
Por favor,
he would
sáqueme de aquí.
take his pie charts and he would explain why central planning didn't work. And maybe underneath it eventually had an effect, because one of the things that Gorbachev tried to do, and George was very proud of this, was he actually tried to have these little private enterprise shoots. They wouldn't privatize the economy as a whole, but they had little entrepreneurial businesses that they started to build called collectives, so that somebody would be able to have a restaurant that was private. And this is sort of 1987,
Pero no hay nada.
1988, and
Pero no hay
George
nada.
actually would go once in a while to these little collectives where a man and his wife, you could only have 8 tables, by the way, you couldn't have more than 8 tables. And so he would go because, and by the way, much to the chagrin of the diplomatic security and the like, he would go down into some town and go to one of these collectives, because he actually did believe that that could be the beginning of capitalism. So he understood that it was too much to try to explain to them that you could have this thing called the market and it would all work out. But these little experiments, he was always very
Es tan
proud of.
interesante que me está haciendo bostezar. Uf,
I can
qué
pick up on
interesantísimo lo
that
que
because
están
I
hablando.
got to deal with it subsequently when the Berlin Wall fell, etc. And so first of all, Gorbachev may have been receptive, but he didn't understand it.
Yeah.
He had grown up in the agriculture. He was Secretary of Agriculture.
Uf,
and they
ahí
were
sería
making sure
durísimo.
he knew
Ojalá saque algo
exactly where
así.
everything was all the time.
Prefiero que diga algo así
So
a que se
when
quede
Bush,
hablando de
Senior
chorradas.
Bush sent me to help them with economic reform, because they announced they were going to become a capitalist economy in 500 days. Not the 5 centuries it took to develop capitalism, but that's a whole other story. So I met with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, and it's pretty clear, I'm Bush's chief economic advisor, so I actually know how all this works. So he sends me to see the head of Gosplan, the state planning agency. And through his interpreter, he asked me, who sets the prices in your economy? And I try to explain, we have a few regulated industries, and there's, et cetera. And I've won teaching awards in my day, but he wasn't having it. He just didn't understand that lots of consumers, lots of producers can interact, and that would determine prices, et cetera. And so he finally gets very frustrated, motions me to wait. He goes back into his office, and we're in an anteroom.
Sí,
Comes back with one of these 1970s we would think of here, but there it's 1990 flip charts, and it's these Fortran flip charts. It's the price list for the Soviet Union. He hands me a pen. He wants me to cross out the old prices and write in the new ones. He can't believe, since Gorbachev has told him, I'm Bush's chief economic advisor,
Mira,
I know what the
estos
prices should be.
de aquí
So he's convinced that I
son
should
los que
just
pensaban
read in
que
new
iba a
prices,
decir
and that
algo
would solve
interesante
his
Powell,
problem.
¿vale?
Because he's been told he
Después
has to
dijeron,
get to
muchacho, no va a
a
decir
price
nada,
system in
no va a decir
500
nada
days. He has the
aburrido,
slightest idea what
lateral.
he's doing. Both in China and in Russia, I've had the experience of people who were more reformers, who spoke some English, but also
No te estás
generally
perdiendo
relied
nada,
on
puedes ir a
translation to be
dormirte ya.
precise, tell me
De hecho,
that
creo que ya la voy a
they
cerrar
can't
porque
get this
no,
across because
faltan
they
10
all
minutos y no
these
está
people
hablando de
have been
nada.
trained as Marxists. They can't, when we ask them, how do you know what's actually going on in the economy? They've never thought about how to measure something like GDP, because the outputs are weighted by market prices. They don't have market prices. They're just used to everything being quantities. these many shoes of this size for this style lady shoe will get shipped to Leningrad or to Vladivostok, etc. That's all they knew. So in any event, it became interesting, and later on, George was a big help to me and Condi, who was a rising superstar in the NFC staff at the time, when I was asked to negotiate a potential bailout with Gorbachev, and he told me, push them hard, they have to threaten to walk out twice so they don't get serious. And because, you know, you can do more harm than good, and that's why we decided to do, even though Bush was being pressured by John Major and Francois Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl to bail out Gorbachev, we decided to do very little.
Jay, I'm wondering if you'll buy this idea, that this represents another aspect of the way George Shultz did public service. He was always teaching. Gorbachev, in this case, but I think, Condi, I think back to there would be some big meeting, some big summit, and he would go to the press, and it would be very methodical.
Yes.
He would want everyone to understand what had happened, what were the central issues, who took what position, and where matters stood now.
George never talked in sound bites.
No.
He simply didn't. There was always depth to it. I think sometimes it was a little frustrating for the press because they wanted him to talk in sound bites. Having been in that job, I know they'd like you to talk in sound bites, but he was determined that people were going to have a real understanding of it.
Jay is not known for sound bites either.
No.
Yeah, no, I would say also George, in a sense, was AI before AI. Because having been in boardrooms and academic seminars, he always would listen carefully, and he would summarize things in a way that really got to the essence of the issue, and what the issues were, and what the path forward, or the potential paths forward were. And it was quite an amazing thing. You'd sit in the boardroom and people would be arguing about this, that, and the other thing. He'd just sit there quietly, and at the end he'd give a succinct, maybe not always so succinct, summary. And,
Pero que cerraste, lo que dije aquí se anuló, ¿eh?
I didn't
No sé qué
know
estás
him anything
operando.
like
Yo ya dije que lo
these
que ya se
Portuguese
anula porque es
folks
muy
knew
lento.
him, but it seems to me people
Va a seguir en rango. Vale, va a
who
seguir en
met him
este
and
rango.
worked with him trusted
Tendré que
him,
variar otro.
and it was based on his integrity and his knowledge and his work product and just the way he dealt with people. So he holds 3 cabinet in ascending importance: labor, OMB, and then treasury, in 3 years, really. So
That's right.
he's getting promoted really quickly and being given the job of desegregating the schools, which wasn't obviously connected to any of those jobs. Then, as Secretary of State, Gorbachev and Shevardnadze just take tremendous liking to him, and they want to work with him. And some of the people who study this stuff give him a lot of credit for. He didn't compromise on his principles, but they trusted him, and they felt that this was someone they could work with, and that President Reagan was really aligned with. Critically, Reagan was aligned with these goals, so he was just very effective in that way. And I think it was liking him, trusting him, having strong principles he didn't compromise, just made him very effective, remarkably effective across so many issues.
Back at Stanford, after the Reagan administration, Mr. Shultz returns to Stanford. He composes his memoirs, Triumph and Turmoil.
No, no dice nada.
He convenes
Es
study
que no le
groups.
preguntó nada.
He continues coming into his Hoover
Le ha
office,
preguntado
well into his...
simplemente
I think he was
de
still
opiniones
showing up in
personales,
his
de economía y
99th
de lo que
year,
hacer
as
por
I
la Fed. No le
recall.
preguntaron
2
nada.
or 3 days a week in his
Así
90s,
que-
which is, by the way, is about as often as kids show
Hasta
up
está
for the
aburrido, míralo.
office these
O sea,
days,
ya
2 or
sabe
3
ni qué
days a
hacer.
week. And so I am just struck that the same things he was doing at the University of Chicago, in all of these Secretary of Labor, Director of OMB, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of State, he continues to do here at the Hoover Institution. Convene, talk. That says something about him, of course. Let me know what you think it says about him that he keeps at it so long, but it also says something about the Hoover Institution, that this remarkable man thought that it was worth making this institution the central activity of his life for the final decades of his time on this planet. Condi?
Well, we called him the great convener because George would he would decide that there was a subject that was of importance and we ought to get the smartest people in the room to talk about it. And it was that simple. And then he would call them up and of course they would all show up. And everything from, and it was not just economics. Mike mentioned he had a very deep interest in California and in trying to make this state better. And you might know that Charlotte, the great Charlotte, was chief of
No, no creo que vaya
protocol
a ser
to
63K.
several
Yo creo que a Sailor
mayors
no le van a tocar.
and governors of the state. And so he was very involved in California and in California policy, not so much politics, but policy. George took a tremendous interest in energy policy. And together with Tom Stevenson convened a task force on energy in which they were concerned not just about energy, but about the issues that related to a clean environment, the climate change, and so worked very hard on those issues. Obviously, anything to do with national security. Another area that people perhaps don't
¿Qué
realize
tiene
how
Phil?
important he thought it was, North
No ha hecho
America.
nada.
He cared about North America because he believed it could be an
Ah,
economic
no, pero
engine.
dejaron todos esa mechita, ¿eh?
If you thought about the
Bueno, creo que
assets
sí.
of
Esto también lo
Canada, the
dejó, ¿eh?
United States, and Mexico
Mira.
together, that this
Aquí
could
lo
be a
dejó.
tremendous economic energy, engine. And
Aquí,
so
bueno,
I always
fueron
thought
más
of
leves,
George's
pero hubo todo
life
mecha.
as an economist,
Mira.
his understanding
Entonces
of the
ejecutó
economy,
mecha.
and the way that he engaged these incredibly important
Yes.
public policy issues as being inherently linked. And it goes back to that belief in markets, to that belief in free enterprise, to that belief in individual liberty, and they would all show up in these convenings that George would do. But his reach across so many public policy issues, very often starting from the economic side and branching out, is really quite extraordinary. I think it made him a far better Secretary of State because he really understood what a lot of these countries were trying to do in providing for their people.
Yeah, and it made Hoover and George a perfect complement to each other because of the wide breadth of interests of the Hoover scholars. We have experts in economics and national security and foreign affairs and education and political science.
El culo que tiene
You
esta
go
tía,
on
¿eh?
and on through energy, etc. So we have
Es que
area
te-
studies of particular interest. And
Calidad por
George
tenerlo así,
was
¿eh?
really, in a sense, interested in everything, or as much as he could, with his immense capacity, accommodate.
Couple last questions for all three of you. If possible, we'll go right down. I'm struck that by this notion that he participates, he's right in the middle of a great debate that takes place for a couple of decades in this country. And by the 1980s, when we get economic revival and a victory
No,
in
no
the
está diciendo
Cold
nada.
War,
Ya va a
it
terminar.
feels as though we've gotten someplace. It feels
Yo
as
creo
though
que
one side of
podemos
the
dejarlo
debate
aquí,
has won.
porque esto ya
Which
no está
brings
hablando de
us
nada,
to
¿vale? Por lo tanto, si quieren ir a dormir, yo creo que se pueden ir a dormir, a cenar, lo que tienen que hacer, porque ya no va a decir nada. Esto va a seguir el rango, ¿vale? Este es el rango. Este era el comprimido, pero el rango real lo voy a poner. El rango real es este, ¿vale? Este es el rango. Por lo tanto, si rompe la parte de arriba para ir a este punto, si rompe la parte de abajo de este rango con cuerpo en 15 minutos, ¿vale? Condicional con cuerpo con 15 minutos, voy a buscar esta zona OT. No hay mucho que decir. Aquí sería la posición más eficiente, ¿vale? Para buscar zonas altas. Más que esto ni nada. No sea que cada uno ya haga lo que quiera y ya vayan a dormir, que es tarde, señores. O a cenar. Bien, gracias a todos. Recuerden meter un like y todos los días hacemos un vídeo, así que si quieren inscribirse, se lo agradezco. Bien, gracias a todos.